Time for another tutorial and for another classic little objective marker, folks. Now I'm going to paint this and I'm going to show you how I made one of my own. You can't buy these anymore. You may find them, especially somewhere like eBay or one of the trading groups on Facebook, but otherwise you're going to have to make one yourself. So let's start by opening up this lovely classic piece. Oh, I've got a War Merit Cross, just in case you're interested. So here we go, folks. Now, one of the definite plus points about something like this, and it really shows how good they are at casting resin pieces at Battlefront, is it's just one piece. You don't have to stick anything onto it. You just have to paint it. Now there's a couple of bits that looks like mould stuck in here, folks, so I'll have to clean that up. You see this white material? I'll have to get that out. You see that sometimes on the old resin kits, typically stuck down in a little recessed area, but otherwise there's very little preparation required. What have we got? Let me see. It looks like a discarded helmet there. There's a, what is that, PPS blah 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 blah, submachine gun, another little bit of mould stuck in there. Then we've got a lovely open top turret. Shouldn't be open top, of course, because it's been blown to bits. And then inside it we've got some nice detail. We can see what looks like some ammunition stowage, some possibly discarded shells or just ammunition stowage knocked loose, some seats, a little bit of the gearbox that might perhaps be there, and then on the back we've got the transmission hatch being blown off and some fenders blown off. There's also some nice shell strikes. That maybe be the killer one there, which would have blown the turret off. So very nice all round, and it's going to be a pleasure to paint this. But what if you haven't got one of these but you want an objective that looks the same? So here is my plastic kit version of this. I'm going to be doing it a little bit different from the original, as opportunity is allowed, and in some ways to keep things simple. For instance, you'll see I've not taken the top off the turret. I'm going to have it lying upside down with the bottom exposed. And you can also see here there is no rear plate on it at all. I've had it, imagine it just the whole thing's blown off, and I have seen historical images that were like that. Now the reason I did that was because of what you can see in there. That is a transmission, a T34 transmission, metal. You got that with the old stowage set for the Soviets. I don't know why they felt a transmission was a reasonable piece of stowage to be carrying around, but it's actually come in handy. Now what I've did here is I've really roughly hacked everything away to make that fit, but it doesn't matter because it is exploded. The bit where a bit of care was required was just cutting out the rear plate, and I'm not going to have that lying on the base at all. There's only so much space. I mean, if you compare with this, you know, there's only so much space to get the thing on the base. So I just hacked it out carefully with a pair of what I would call proper modelling snippers. You see how thin those are, and you can probably get even thinner ones. What you don't want to be using is kind of like general purpose ones, kind of you get in general purpose DIY stores and so on, because they don't cut sharp. When I say sharp, I mean they leave a notable like a peak on each cut, whereas these, when you're cutting, will get you nice sharp edges that you just need to file down a bit. That was easy bit, and you can see a little bit of card in there, by the way, just to give this some support, because normally the rear end, you can see it's even sagged a little bit. The rear end would be supported by the hull that I have cut away here. But that was the easy bit, folks. This is the difficult bit because, as I'll show you on the sprue here, it's a solid bottom, so that had to be cut out. I did that using a rotary tool. Now, I made sure it was still stuck to the sprue when I was doing it so that I could safely hold the piece, use the rotary tool and not put my fingers in any kind of danger. So I recommend you do that yourself, however you're going to approach cutting the bottom out. Now, I did it from this side because it's got a nice guide in here, you can see that. And it was just a case of moving the rotary tool around. If you don't have a rotary tool, what you could do is using a standard electric drill, the kind that you would just use for normal DIY purposes with a suitable bit. Just drill lots of holes around and then with a knife cut out what's left. Then you can sand as required just with an ordinary file to get as round and as smooth, and this isn't perfect, as round and as smooth an opening as possible. A trickier bit was getting the right size opening on the hull. Now once again I made sure the hull was attached to the sprue. I then took the bottom of the turret before I put the top on and using a bit of blue tack, held it in place, then marked it out with a knife, just going around because remember we're seeing this hole, the top's not on, marked it around, and then I'd use my rotary tool once again to make the hole. So that was a little bit tricky, but it wasn't difficult. Now if you've got the right tools it'll be easier. And then the last thing I did was to put a little bit of detail on the inside without worrying too much, without overdoing it. I'm not trying to create seats and everything. That's something you can do, folks, but you know that this is going to just be an objective marker as opposed to a scale model kit. So I like to do more but not do too much. So it was really just a question before the top was glued on of putting some panelling down on the floor and then a couple of spare shells. Oh, look at that, folks. I'll have to fix that. A couple of spare shells from an 8-8 just lying on there just for a little bit of detail, but it's going to be pretty much blackened and burnt out in there. So it's really just something to add a bit of texture. Now that is coming away, so I'll tell you what, folks. Let's get some thin super glue. Not super glue, sorry folks. Some thin plastic glue. And just, you know, that's far too much. That would run everywhere, folks. It's such a high capillary action on this thin glue. It wouldn't be a good outcome. So be careful. There you go, that'll flow into that tiny wee gap and bond it nicely together. So there you go, folks, that's going to be mine. It's going to be, I'll put these down side by side so you can get an, one extra point, folks, because we can see inside the turret I need a breech. So I took a breech from a 6-pounder. If you had a Soviet anti-tank gun set like the 76mm or the 57mm, then that would be very useful here, folks. You can cut a breech off any extra barrels because you get the two options in the set and stick that in, but I've just used a 6-pounder because it's a good size and glued that in there. Really simple but also effective. So I'm going to be looking at something like that. I'll maybe put it right in the centre of the video for you. So it's going to be looking something like that. So that's assembly done on this. Let's get on to painting the classic version. Now on to the painting, and as I normally do, I'm going to be using my airbrush for this, but you don't have to use an airbrush. You can of course use the same colours that I am applying here and use a good old-fashioned hairbrush. One thing you will struggle to do with a hairbrush that is easy to do with an airbrush is modulation. And by modulation here I'm talking about quite just a simple 3-step light through to dark, highlight through to shade transition across the panels. I'm using 3 colours to achieve this. first of all the shade coat, which is German Camo Dark Green, then the main coat, which is Camo Olive Green, and then the highlight, which is Green Grey. I'm using a very cheap airbrush to do this, folks. The most important thing is that it generally works well mechanically and that it's double action. So you're pushing down for air, pulling back for paint. And if you maintain the airbrush, it will give you good results. You don't have to buy an expensive airbrush unless that's something you would rather spend money on. You can get very good results with basic kit. You just got to follow my channel to see what can be achieved. So what I've done so far is I've applied an overall coat of German Camo Dark Green, and now I'm applying the main colour, which is Camo Olive Green. When I'm spraying this on, I want to be leaving shade on the bottom areas of panels, or for instance between the side panel and the fenders. Now that can be quite tricky and requires a degree of practice to be able to get it right. I tend to spray in such a way that overspray will shoot past the figure, and where necessary I will do some masking, typically around hatches or perhaps on adjacent flat panels. It's important to remember when you are airbrushing on like this that you're putting what is basically like a semi-opaque layer on. You know, the airbrush paint comes out nice and thin, so you're not going to get it done in one pass. You're going to have to go around the figure, spray your main colour, remember this is not the highlight, and then go back around and spray it again. And when you're doing that second pass, it's also very important at that point that you sort of firm up the amount of shade that you're leaving, because if you leave more than just a hint of shade, it's going to really dominate, and you're going to notice that most when you put the highlight on. So it's important at this stage to really keep that shading level under control. Now on to the green grey highlight. Now this is going to take an extra bit of care, because you only want to apply this to the top of panels or the edges of panels. So you've really got to be careful about the level of air and paint that you're letting come out of that airbrush, folks. As with the main colour, make sure that you are just catching the edge of panels, being careful where your overspray is going and using masking where required. A hell of a lot of time, folks, I just use my fingers for masking. It covers most situations if you're controlling your airbrush correctly, but you can cut out bits of card, or possibly I use post-its for instance, if there is something particularly sharp and tricky that I want to keep accurate. With this highlight colour, it's important that you just stick to the top edges of panels. Don't start drifting down with it. But it's also important that it's nice and distinctive and bright at this stage, because once you apply the gloss varnish, which we'll do at the end of the airbrushing process, it will act like a filter and soften everything down. So if that final highlight isn't strong enough, it will just kind of disappear into the background. And remember, we're still going to be doing weathering and washing and all kind of things, so once again it takes a bit of experience to know what the right level is, but don't be too shy about how bright it is. Just make sure it doesn't drift down the panel or across the panel. Now normally this would be the end of the airbrushing process for me, but I'm going to be painting wrecks here, so I'm going to use the airbrush to apply rust and soot. Now I'm after a very particular look here for this burnt out tank, and I'm going to start by spraying on a rust colour, Villaggio Light Rust, and it is going to define the extent of the burnt out damage, the full extent. But once I'm finished, this rust is just going to appear as a fringe around the blackened hull to represent areas of the hull that didn't get burnt but were heated up enough for the paint to flake off and for the hull under there to rust. But remember, this is not going to be a tank that's been sitting for months getting rusty. This is a freshly burnt out wreck. I'm going to have two burnt out areas on the tank. The main one is on the side where the shell strike is and around the turret ring, and then on the hatch that's been popped off the transmission area on the back. And of course this is being completed after a few passes, remember folks. As with the main colours, this is a semi-opaque layer you're spraying on, so keep the transition between the rust and the hull right on the edge nice and soft, but otherwise give a nice solid layer. And then we're on to the black, which is going to be, as I said, the most dominant colour in terms of visible damage to the hull. So just leave a little fringe of the rust around the black, and then a nice solid coat of black onto the core of that area. And you can see I'm also spraying onto the wheels. And as I'm seeing this has been a fire in the main body of the tank, I am going to blacken the interior of the turret. You know, perhaps the fire built up, burnt up, and then popped the turret off. And also, of course, the interior of the tank itself, you can see there. After this, one more stage with the airbrush is to apply a thin coat of gloss varnish. The gloss varnish will help us with the weathering and washing stages, but don't put it on too thick, folks. If you follow the channel regularly, you'll be familiar with the way that I wash my tanks. I apply a pin wash, which is a very controlled application into panel lines, recessed areas and such likes. Pin washes are most commonly applied with enamel washes because they can be thinned down really good with the appropriate kind of thinners, and that gives it a very good capillary action, and you can clean it off easily once again with thinners, gives you a bit more time to work. Enamel washes, however, do come with vapours and fumes, so I prefer an acrylic approach, and I was pleased to be able to find this MIG Ammo acrylic wash that can be thinned down with water to give very good capillary action. By that I mean it flows along panel lines, along recesses, around features, and it does so in a way that's very easy to control and can be cleaned up just as well as the enamel products. Hopefully you can see here from the video how straightforward it is to apply this. If you get a little bit of the wash onto flat areas that you don't want, just clean your brush, get it just a little bit damp. You don't want it to wet the surface, you just want it to be damp enough to draw the excess paint off with the brush or drawn back into the feature that you want to shade. It's not overly time consuming to do this, and the benefits are that you're going to be able to get a really good contrast between the shade and the subsequent highlight, and that will really help frame all the components of the kit and help it stand out nice and clearly on the tabletop with some nice clean lines. When I'm using enamel washes, I typically wait until the following day before painting around it with acrylics, for instance on the edges of panel lines. You don't want to be applying acrylic paint across damp or wet enamel paint, but the advantage of this acrylic wash is that you can get stuck straight in as soon as it's touched dry. So the lack of fumes and vapours and the quick drying time is a great advantage when you've got a lot of tanks to paint, especially for myself as a commission painter. I may be washing upwards of 15 to 20 tanks in a day. And one last point to make. Apply it with a thin brush. You can see I'm using a long thin brush here. You want to control the amount of paint that you are putting on to the area so it doesn't flood. If you get the right amount of paint and a bit of practice will show you what that level is, it'll just flow off the brush and flow along the various shading lines. Next up then, the highlighting. And I'm going to do this in two stages. First of all, hitting the outside edges and the easy to reach panel lines and other features, and then the more difficult areas to reach, the areas that might need a bit more precision, such as bolts, such as hatch hinges and so on. I'm going to use a fine brush to do that. When applying the fine detail, I will also apply some scratches. This is some light colour scratches using the highlight colour. Now the highlight colour you can see I'm using here is green grey. It's a colour that will lighten the edges just as I did in the airbrushing, but it's not going to brighten the edges. It's not going to give them a bit of a neon glow, so to speak, but it will make them clearly stand out against the rest of the body of the kit. You can see me using the edge of the brush here to catch edges, and I'm not painting these edges as solid lines. This isn't edge highlighting in Space Marine style. By using a broken line, we can still get a nice solid highlight that will catch the eye without it being too severe. And this broken element to the highlight also starts the chipping process. Here you can see me using a finer brush to highlight some of the details where I could not get the edging into, as well as bolts, nuts and such likes. So it's a bit tricky. It's not as easy as just hitting an edge. You have to be careful when you're drawing your brush along these sharp edges. Once again, trying to, where appropriate, keep the edge broken, but if it's a small area, don't worry too much about that. And you may find as you're using a small brush that the paint might dry out quite quick on the brush, so keep refreshing it. The paint has to flow nicely off the brush, not drag off the brush. It has to apply precisely to the edge or feature that you want to highlight, not spill across that feature. So it takes just a little bit of experience to get the brush just right and the paint flowing just right. Here I'm applying some chips to the flat surfaces and around and across panels. Not only is this an interesting feature in terms of weathering, it also breaks up large panels, gives them a bit of depth, so that your eye can focus on certain little features, which then brings the whole vehicle into a bit more of a focus for you. But it's easy to overdo this, so make sure you're not doing too much. Make sure you're keeping these chipping lines and dots really thin. Then the final stage of the chipping is to apply a dark coloured core to these light coloured chips. The idea here being that the lighter chipping colour represents shallow surface chips, paint that has been exposed, that is not weathered down like the rest of the surface, so looks a bit lighter. And then the dark core of the chips, and you don't have to do that in every single one. The dark core will represent exposed metal that has rusted or weathered down to a darker colour, and the colour I use for this is German Camo Black Brown. Next up is the tracks, and I'm going to start by giving them an undercoat of olive brown. I find this to be a nice base colour for tracks because it's an earthy, stony kind of colour, but there are of course many other approaches you can take here, folks. There is a dedicated track primer in the Panzer Aces range that looks similar to this, and you can use browns for perhaps a rusty base colour. The choice is yours. Then for metallic finish, I'm going to do what you might call a very wet dry brush of metallic paint across the raised and flat surfaces of the edges and the front, the back and interior of the track surface. You want to be very careful here, folks, because you don't want that metallic paint getting on the rest of the figure. If this was a standalone figure, i.e. not on a base, I would do this process before the varnish process too, because when you're handling metallic paint like this, it can transfer onto your fingers and then move around the figure and get lots of little metallic flecks. So that's something worth considering for other normal kits. Okay, now that the boring tracks are out of the way, let's have a bit of fun and add a bit of character to this destroyed tank. I'm going to work on the burnt out interior. You see me using white or off-white just to get some, let's say, the remains of some interior surface showing. I'm using a messy old brush here because I want a random scratchy look to this. I'm going to be weathering it down further with some black pigment. It doesn't have to look precise here at all, folks. It just has to give the indication of the remains of that white painted interior. I'm also going to paint the breech dark grey with a little bit of a highlight of London grey just to give it a bit of an edge. Next, the black pigment. This is a little weathering set that Tamiya produce, and this is the soot pigment, and as you can see I'm just going to prepare it before I apply it and then start adding it to the interior, just darkening things down, burning things up, getting it nice and dirty and covering up that white so that it's not too strong but it's still visible. Be careful how thick you're applying your pigments. If when you're mixing it on your palette it's looking very opaque like a normal paint would perhaps, then chances are you've got too much pigment and you need to thin it down a bit more, but a bit of practice will keep you straight. Once the pigment is dry, and it shouldn't take too long folks, the water just needs to evaporate, I'll go back to the white and the scratchy old brush and just put in just a little bit of white, dots, lines, totally random, just to help bring out the white a little bit, but not too much here folks. Remember it's burnt out, we just want it to look like a burnt out white interior, not a white interior that has got some burning. The emphasis has got to be on the burning. Now I'm going to show you the homemade version just now because I'm doing the crew compartment a bit differently. I'm going to be having that one burnt out towards the rear as you can see, so the crew compartment just needs to be a bit smoky, shall we say, rather than black. So I've started by giving it a very rough coat of white or off-white. Even ivory works good for this folks as a starting point, and then just using the acrylic wash I'm going to start by adding some pin lines and then just getting it nice and messy. Little dots, little splodges of the wash, mess them around, push them around as they're drying just to get a smoky look, but one that's not completely burned out. I'm going to use that same wash over the features of the burnt out transmission. Time for some more work on the exterior of the tank. Now in the same way as I used chips to draw panels out, so to speak, to give them more depth, I'm going to use a little bit of my original rust colour, that's the Panzerace's light rust, to put just some little marks, little, I'm not going to call them scratches because they're not really scratches, they're like dots and dashes and weird little amoeba shapes or whatever, but very very small, onto the rusted area and also just into the blackened area. You know, that'll kind of draw those two areas together, but it just helps lift it out of the background and just gives it a bit more focus. Here I'm applying a coat of German grey to the exposed turret ring, you know, that would have sat in the hull opening. Now you could blacken this down a bit, but I've decided here just to paint it with the grey because it would be pretty well covered up. The edges that we can see here would be covered up at the time that the turret was sitting on the tank when it was on fire, but you can be as creative here as you want to be and tell the story as you want to. And here I am painting it into the opening of the homemade version because that is not blackened in any way folks. Now for some weathering. And that's weathering that was there before the tank was knocked out, and for this I'm going to start with some streaks. Streaks or rain marks are a great way to add a bit of weathering to your tank. They're very simple to do, but they can be overdone, so don't go too over the top with it. Just as with the wash, you could use an enamel product for this, but you can also use the acrylic product that I applied the wash with. Now I washed these with a dark brown colour, and that's the pin wash, and for the streaks I'm going to use the ochre colour. There's also a sand colour that will give you a much brighter, more obvious streak against a dark surface like this, but I quite like the ochre colour here. It's, you can still see it, but it's still subtle enough. Now remember, when you're drawing the lines down to create the streaks, that they need to follow gravity, and that is gravity on the tank as it is sitting flat, not as it is sitting here, unless you want to make this a wreck that has been in position for a long time. So draw the line down, draw the line up, draw it one side, draw it the other side with a damp brush, not a wet brush, and it will soften it up quite nicely and you'll be able to refine the shape. And that goes for enamels or for acrylics, whatever product you want to choose. Now for the shell impacts, I'm just going to use a metallic paint. I'm going to use silver so it's nice and bright, because this will be fresh, raw, exposed metal. And taking quite a rough brush, to be honest here folks. I'm not wanting a lot of accuracy here. I want a scratchy look. I am just going to apply it to the strikes, as you can see, nice and simple. The final stage of the weathering is going to be some pigment work. Now you can see I prepare the pigments on a palette in advance of applying it to the figure. You may see tutorials online for scale model kits where they apply the pigments directly to the kit, but these are big kits folks. This is a tiny little kit. You're better to prepare it, get it at the right consistency and the right amount of pigment, which isn't actually very much, and then with a brush you can apply it directly to the areas that you want, pretty much in the same way as you would a wash. Now I'm not applying this all over the tank folks, especially once again at the scale you have to be controlled about these things. I am going to put it along the top of the fenders, around the mudguards, on the tracks and on the wheels. When working with pigments, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you have not applied enough. It's better to let what you've put on dry, see how it looks, and then either soften it down if it's too much or add some more. This is how it's looking after it's dried, and I'm generally happy with it, except for the wheels. There's a bit too much on there folks. And another point, you should really leave it lying on its side and then turn it over from time to time as you're waiting for the pigment to dry on the wheels. Otherwise, it's mostly water. It's going to just run down to the bottom. So we're going to use a wet brush here, not sodding wet folks, just enough to lift off the excess pigment where we don't want it or where we want to control the amount that is visible. Now you can use Pigment Fixer. It's a product that's designed to lock pigments in place, but what you have to remember is it is a liquid, it's a wash, and when you apply it to the pigments it's going to lock that application, and if you're not happy with it, well, you're kind of stuck with it. So I prefer just to seal it in place with the final coat of matte varnish that will be applied to the completed kit. But there's one thing to remember with matte varnish, it kind of reactivates the pigments to a degree and softens it. So you need to put it on just a little bit heavier than what you think the finished look should be. Now for the earth, I have painted it with a coat of Panzerhaus German Tank Crew Highlight. German Tank Crew is black, but this highlight is actually a nice earthy brown. It actually looks quite good as a highlight for black folks, but on a larger scale. But here it makes a great earth colour, and I'm going to use pigments to just give it a bit more of a gritty, earthy finish. A wash just as before, except all over the surface. Let's take a look at how I made the very simple base for my homegrown objective. And you can see I started with a piece of milliput, let that dry. That will allow me to get the same sort of kilter to the hull that's on the original. And then I'm going to use this Fellatio product, that's my go-to product for basing folks, and I'm just going to start layering it over the base. This is a very simple product, easy to work with. Just make sure you're not leaving any really obvious ridges or tool marks. It'll self-level to a degree, but just make sure that you're not leaving any prominent marks. A lot of it will get covered up subsequently by the grass, so it doesn't have to be perfect. As this is a lightweight plastic kit, I can use the same basing material to glue it to the surface. And you can either do this onto the wet surface, as I'm doing here, or you can leave the base to dry overnight and then attach the tank the following day. that can be handy if you really want to build up like additional mud, for instance, around the tracks. That's always done better over a dry surface. And I'm going to attach the turret in the same way. Just find the right position for it. Measure it by eye. There we go. And then another dollop of the basing material in the appropriate place, and then just press it down. Leave it to dry overnight, and then you can paint it as we did with the original objective, and give it a wash of pigments again before we add any grass, ground cover, tufts and such likes. And that's us folks, that's us finished now. Hopefully you found this video interesting from the point of view of maybe even just painting Soviet tanks, or maybe even giving you some ideas for your own Soviet objectives. So I'll end the video with some nice pictures, nice slideshow of the completed objective markers with the groundwork on there. So as always folks, thanks for watching, and thanks to all the subscribers out there, and to you folks that just drop into the channel from time to time to see what's going on. If you want to help us build the channel, you can always hit the subscribe button, and if you hit the bell button, that means we'll definitely see you all on the next one.